The next part of Criterion C is strand C2, interpreting data using scientific reasoning. The key here is that you interpret the data accurately, first of all, and that you reference the data and you explain what kind of conclusions you can draw from your data, trying to reference specific numbers or reasons for that interpretation. You also want to compare your results back to your hypothesis or your expected outcome. To try to gauge whether or not you can trust your results, whether or not they seem accurate based on what you predicted. And the scientific concepts or scientific reasoning that's included in that expected outcome or in that hypothesis will be evaluated here as well to make sure that what you're comparing it against is reasonable and accurate. So in strand 2 in this exemplar lab report, we have a graph here. It shows the trend line, which seems to obviously be a linear trend line fitting the data points. And so in this data interpretation, the student has interpreted the values and specifically ends the conclusion by talking about how the data shows that there's a linear relationship between the independent and dependent variables, and they even reference the equation of the trend line. So they didn't just say that as the concentration of the HCl goes up, the average rate of reaction increases as well. They've actually gotten specific into the type of relationship, the linear relationship, and they've referenced the exact equation that they were able to draw from their data. Now, they could get into this more. They could mention what the slope means. They could mention the units for the slope to give it a little bit more meaning. But they have correctly interpreted the type of relationship, and they have referenced some actual values in their data to justify why that's their conclusion, their interpretation. Then they've compared what they found to accepted scientific understanding. So they re-mention their hypothesis. That's the first sentence here. The hypothesis was that an increase in concentration would lead to an increase in the rate of reaction. And then they go through point by point with their different concentrations and the different average rate of reaction values that they were able to achieve with their data. And then they re-explain the scientific reasoning behind why that was their hypothesis in the first place. And this is something that most students forget to do. They maybe briefly mention their hypothesis again in the conclusion, but they don't go back into the expected outcome enough. So really make sure that beyond interpreting your data clearly and why you're able to say that, you also compare to the hypothesis and you re-explain why your hypothesis was that in the first place. So you're re-explaining the scientific reasoning, and make sure it's accurate. Double check your sources and your materials for why you said that in the first place. So you're re-explaining the scientific content. If you're doing a lab where you don't have a scatter graph and a trend line, where you have a bar chart, then you're going to want to compare the different columns or bars that you have, and you're going to be talking about whether or not there is a significant difference between those values. You're going to be talking about the average values and also the error bars, the standard deviations, and talking about whether or not there is overlap, whether or not there is a significant difference or not a significant difference, or if it's too hard to tell, and maybe you're not confident that there's a difference or not. So you're actually referencing what the graph looks like, what the data looks like, in order to come to your conclusion about what the data shows you. And then, same thing, compare your results back to the hypothesis and the scientific understanding. Make sure to really explain why it supports or doesn't support your hypothesis. And please avoid saying that it has proven your hypothesis. We can only support or not support our hypothesis.